everybody, Steven here. Today I'm going to talk about what I would like to call as monsters of Marvel Universe. Of course, each of these that you see in front of you comes from different specific toy lines, and all of these were released in the second half of the 90s by Toybiz, so that would be roughly pretty much quite before Marvel Legends were introduced. Most of these, some of these at least, look quite bulky in appearance, and some of them have action features or they work on batteries. So I'm going to start with the very first one that I couldn't fit on my cascading display stairs there, and that would be this fellow, and he's enormous, as you can see. It's quite large, with enormous feet and hands. Now you're probably wondering, is that Spider-Man because of the scraps of his costume over here? Well, actually yes, this is Spider-Man and not quite all the way him. This fellow is called Spider-Lizard. It's a mutation between Spider-Man and the lizard, his enemy. There were roughly 3 figures in this particular wave, and this wave was called Arachnophobia. It only had 3 mutated characters in there. I have 2 here that today I'm going to talk about out of 3. The first one here, as I said, is the Spider-Lizard. He has a lot of detail all over him, especially you can see the scraps of what was left of Spider-Man's costume. He also has small clawed arms on the side of his body, one on each side, and also some on his back as well. None of these are really articulated unless you use the action feature on it. The head can move left and right, and I'll show you the bit of a detail. He has these claws sticking on the side of his face on each side, which is, I guess, partially his spider mutation kicking in as well. He has a long tongue. He also has what looks like spider eyes or something of that sort along his wrist in the shape of an armor. Then clawed fingers, additional claws on the side. He has an enormous rubber tail attached to the back of him. That tail can be rotated. And at the end of that tail seems to be a sort of like a spider head molded on the end of it, which is quite scary looking. And what else? He does have that feature that I mentioned. He doesn't come with any weapons because in this particular case he doesn't really need any. And you can see again leftover of his costume as it completely ripped and transformed him into a monster. Now this wind-up liver here doesn't work anymore because after so many years it just gave up. But what was the point of it? First of all, when you wind it up and let it rip, it would practically make Spider-Lizard here move his arms in a frantic fashion. The 4 little arms, they would move all over him and spin in circles as well. So that was the feature of that, and you can also see that he has quite a bit of a detail on his body as well, aside from the things I already mentioned. There is all sorts of ripped skin that's turning green and some kind of spider aspects on him along the middle of his body. Very big claws on his feet with 2 clawed toes, and they're quite large. Some spikes on the knees as well. A ripped part of his costume that serves like some kind of almost ripped up pants, kind of like in Hulk. Now, probably some of you, when you saw this figure first, were thinking, wait a minute, this is probably not a Spider-Lizard. You probably thought that this would be Spider-Hulk. By the way, the Spider-Hulk figure does exist, and it's also from Toybiz, but it was released years later. This kind of toy line where this figure comes from was mostly aimed at collectors, and it had an enormous packaging for each of the 3 figures. They were packaged separately. Among the 3 of them, Spider-Lizard here, and also a character called Vampeder, if I am pronouncing it correctly, which would be practically like a Venom combined with a vampire. And it would be bulky like this and enormous. Unfortunately, I did not find him as of yet. But that's another large figure that would work on batteries, that when you press the lever on that other one, he would let out a very nasty growl out of his mouth and so forth. So that was the catch thing about these figures, such as this one, that they would either have an action feature of some sort or they would have a much superior sculpting. So that would be Spider-Lizard in his entirety. And even though the action feature doesn't work, he still looks good. Pretty good and very bulky. There is a bit of weight to him. So it's not just a hollow piece of plastic. Okay, so the next one that also from the same line, and the only other one I have, and he's missing a cape. That's the only thing he's missing. This particular fellow, he's missing a cape, and then you're wondering, wait a second, that head, that must be Green Goblin, but he looks weird. Why is he wearing Spider-Man's costume? That's because this is again a mutation, or as they say, arachnophobia mutation. This is Spider-Man combined with the Green Goblin. And in that case you get a character called Spider-Goblin. You can see a great deal of Spider-Man's costume still on him, except the head is that of the Green Goblin, with enormous pointy ears and a huge snake or lizard tongue, a snake tongue of a sort. He does have a lever for winding up, kind of like, pretty much the same like Spider-Lizard. So in this case, when you wind him up, and by the way, he is missing his cape. That's the only thing he's missing. So when you wind him up, see, his hands would move. So let's do that again. There we go. So luckily he still works somewhat, which is good. Articulation wise, he can move his legs about that much forward, and he does have articulation in the knees as well. And he also has it in the upper part near the knees, so he can turn left and right. So that was already experimenting with making the figures more articulated. A precursor to what's yet to come, meaning Marvel Legends, when they showed up. And he can make his legs are usually apart like this, but at least you could move the whole leg backwards, but you cannot move it backwards, but you can at least align it. But if he's standing in a crotch position like this and there is no ankle pivot at that time, it did not exist yet, so he would look kind of awkward trying to stand with this much legs apart. So you would have to just sort of bend the legs a bit to position him to stand a bit better and make his feet at least flat on the ground. He did not have any waist articulation, and no elbow articulation, and no wrist, no ankle, so all that was missing, and the waist especially. The head could turn left to right, a minimal movement, but it could at least, and the arms could go sideways, so you could put arm up this much on the side or this much down. And he has quite a face to look at, as you can see. Rather scary looking. So that's as far as goes for the Spider-Goblin. They had some interesting mixtures of them. What I forgot to mention about the Spider-Lizard here is his articulation. It would be pretty much the arms going all the way around, but mine got stuck after being in storage for too long, so you cannot really move them around anymore. But at least they could move forward and backward, and the legs don't have any articulation other than here in the, and that you could sort of move his legs up, but more they're going sideways, and that's the only way you could move them. You could pretty much move them backwards too, but then it would look kind of weird. So there is a possibility of trying to kind of reposition him in slightly different ways, and the head does rotate as well. If I already mentioned some of this earlier, I apologize for that. It's just that I'm trying to keep up track of that, to make sure that I didn't forget about the articulation for those of you who care to know if these figures had any articulation at all. So moving forward, we're going to a similar line that was made around the same time as Arachnophobia, and it was based on X-Men characters being monsters. Again, 3 figures were only released, and each of them had, they were deluxe figures, very large, in also a large box packaging, and they worked on batteries. So we will start. I have again 2 out of 3. I'll start with the larger one of the 2. This is not a werewolf, no, not really. This is supposed to be Beast from X-Men, when he was corrupted by Mr. Sinister and transformed into a darker version of himself, which is a lot more bigger, a lot more savage looking, but his smartness was, I guess, used in the exact opposite way for him to be an evil genius. So he definitely looks aggressive and even more wild than before, and now serving Mr. Sinister and Apocalypse, I guess. So this is his action feature. If you just move the hands, you will hear him growl by just moving either of the arms up a bit, but you could also activate it in a much easier way. This is where the batteries go, and you would just have to press the lever down and just watch what happens. He shouts and his jaw opens and he lets out a very loud growl, and he swings his arms up in the air. And even when he smashes his hands up on the ground, then he still has the same sound coming out. He's a heavy figure. I would say even heavier than some of the Hulk figures I talked about in one of the previous videos. He does have articulation in the elbow this time around, but none in the wrist, so he could move his arm pointing this way, and the same would go for his other arm. He has he's actually not dark blue in color this time around, but more gray, and you can see his face, quite a savage looking. He's covered in thick hairs and so forth, and some white hairs on the side, very red eyes, and the head cannot move because of that action feature, so only the jaw is articulated. He's not wearing any clothes whatsoever other than the pants, which are not ripped, surprisingly. His hands are enormous and had very well done long fingers and dark nails that he could rip his enemies apart. So at the back here you can hear there's a little speaker on the side, the battery compartment, and the lever that activates the action feature. And what we also have is articulation in the lower part of his leg, so he can turn his whole foot 360 degrees on both sides. And the legs cannot really move much because they're just more or less static, very minor movement in it, not enough to move them forward and so forth. But the arms can be moved on their own, but of course every time you do that you will activate the feature. So they're more like spring-loaded, pre-positioned for the action feature only. And that would be the Dark Beast. Now the other one that came from the same lineup, I'm gonna talk about him now for a while, would be Wolverine as a sort of a werewolf. According to what I understand, he never looked like this in comics whatsoever, but he does exist. Now of course anybody who may have seen him look like this in comics, you can just post down in the comments and let me know. I'm just not familiar that he had a look like this before. So this is the Wolverine as werewolf, or even as an actual werewolf, or even as an actual Wolverine animal, just mutated. He is not as bulky as the Beast, but close, in the sense of Wolverine was never bulky in appearance to begin with. So this is how he looks as a toy, again from the same X-Men Monsters series. He has articulation, and again same type of molded hands that are very detailed and covered in fur. He has articulation in the elbow, none in the wrist. his arms could be raised and moved sideways as well. He has a pretty nasty looking animal face with fangs and spring-loaded jaw, because it's part of his action feature. Very red eyes. His ripped up costume can be seen still clinging onto him. Parts of his boots. And the battery compartment would be right here. Again, just like in Dark Beast, he has a small speaker built in there, and the lever. Now, unfortunately, the action feature doesn't work anymore, but the point was that when you press the lever down, he is moving his arms back and forth, ready to, it's a sort of an intimidating stance, ready to attack, and his jaws would open and he would let out a growling sound, something similar to the Dark Beast. But that's pretty much what would be the point of it. You can also see still the leftover of his belt and the blue shorts as well. So that would be Wolverine as the werewolf. Quite an interesting take on him. And the remaining two figures I'm going to cover here today is one of the best Venom figures from the vintage line that I consider being the best. He comes from, again, a mid to late 90s toy line called the Planet of the Symbiotes. That line did not have any Spider-Man figures in it, but it had all the known symbiotes that were released or that were shown in the comics, or that were created in the comics at that time. Carnage, unfortunately, is missing at that time, but Venom, being the main one, was shown there along with the several other newly created symbiotes, one of them being a woman. The other ones had the names like the female version of a symbiote had the name Scream. Another one a couple of other guys who were also symbiotes had the names such as Riot and similar mayhem names to it. And in the particular case of this Venom, he has an action feature. He doesn't work on batteries, mind you, but I'll get into that in a minute. He also has very well sculpted hands, just like the Beast and the werewolf Wolverine. He has these tendrils coming out of them. And in another hand, he's just has the tendril built into his fist. And he has a lot of these little Venom arms made of rubber, soft rubber, on both sides of his arms. He has a lot of little Venom heads surrounding him, surrounding his main head right here. So that's quite a detail. He's a scary looking one, the scariest version yet. And he can move his head left to right. He has a huge white spider symbol on his chest. No articulation in the waist, none in the elbow. The arms can move up. There is two more color variations of this same figure. In one he is fluorescent green, completely fluorescent green, so same figure just in a fluorescent green color. And in another one he is completely yellow. But in all three cases, understand those variations are hard to find, and to some extent this version is also sort of hard to find these days. His legs can move forward about that much. He cannot bend in the knees or anything like that because he's already pre-positioned. And this is the action feature. So there is a big button at the back here. So this is what happens when you press it. Three of the heads are jumping out as if they're ready to attack. And this particular Venom, it's still Eddie Brock underneath, for all those of you who know who Venom is and you have watched the movie as well. This is still Eddie Brock underneath this figure, and the name of this particular Venom from that toy line would be called Venom Madness, as if to indicate this is how Venom looked like when he went completely insane for wearing the symbiote suit for too long. So the Venom became even more nastier looking than in his original appearance. So that would be as far as this version of Venom goes, and I'll just finish my talk with one last presentation of another very unusual looking Venom that I have. Just a moment. Okie dokie. So we'll put him on the side here. And this is the one I would like to talk about. This is an alien Venom figure. I believe that's the correct name. As you can tell, he looks extremely nasty looking and quite weird, to say the least. I don't remember him looking like this in comics, but then again, I did not really read every comic out there. He seems to be a hybrid of Venom and Alien, an alien from the Alien movies. And he has some very unusual, the way I used to think of him when I saw him first, he seems to have these large, sorry, not large, but long, extended ears. So I kind of viewed him as a deranged rabbit, because he looks quite nasty, and these to me look like rabbit ears because they're so long. And he has a very nasty face with all his teeth pointing flat down, which is so strange. The jaw cannot be opened, but he does look somewhat weird. He does come with a tail, a very long tail, that's not possible to bend it or anything, and has no articulation to it. And you can see sort of the bony extension of his spine stretching all the way at the back of him onto the tail and to the tip of to almost tip of the tail. He has so many claws all over his body, especially on the elbows, and his fingers are just plain bone, with only the hand itself not being bone. So he can inflict quite a bit of damage with bony fingers like these. And on his feet are only partially covered in the symbiote. The rest is just two clawed extensions made of bone. And he has articulation, by the way, in the knees, none in the waist. He has it in the knees and also in the lower part, closer to the ankles. He also has articulation, and again small bony protrusions. The legs can move, although with a bit of difficulty they can move about that much forward, and they can move about that much backwards. So equal in the same sense. His waist is so thin, so there is no way of putting any articulation there. His hands have articulation in the wrist, none in the elbow, but the arms can be raised all the way up, and the head is somewhat articulated, but mostly up and down rather than left and right. And he can put his head sideways, so it seems that the head is on a swivel, so that he could move it sideways, which is an interesting improvement at that time. At this point, this was just experimenting more and more with the figures by the Toybiz company, of trying to include more articulation as they went on. So he can move his head all the way sideways like that. So there is several range of motions that you could do with the head. And he's extremely long, extremely tall figure. I did not really measure him, but I would say he's around 7 inches tall, more or less. And he's very skinny and lean looking figure. He still has his Spider-Man emblem on him. You can even see when I put him all the way up here, he's definitely taller than the Monster deluxe figures. He's towering over all of them due to his height. Let's see if I was to put Beast next to him, the Dark Beast. You can tell that he's way taller than even him, just because of his structure and the way he was made to be an extraordinarily tall figure. So with that one, I would just like to bring this discussion of mine to a close. I've been trying to keep it interesting for you guys that there is actually a lot of monster characters out there, but unfortunately they only had appearance in the vintage toy line, not so much in the newer Marvel Legends or older Marvel Legends, but I find them to be great figures. So that would be my discussion on the monster figures. So that's it from me for now. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll catch you guys again next time. Thanks for watching. Bye.